Welcome to SIIA's Tech Chats. I am delighted to be joined by Richard Neff of Neff Law Firm. The Neff Law Firm focuses on technology, media, e-commerce, copyright law, with a specialty in international transactions and IP enforcement. Rich, thank you for being with us today.
Rihanna.
Now, you guys do a lot of work in international transactions. Can we talk a little bit about Brexit? Everybody's talking about it. You hear a lot in the news about businesses planning to pull out of the UK early next year. What impact will this have on companies doing business in the UK and globally for that matter? And what do companies need to think about or do to prepare for it?
Hi, Rihanna. It's great to see you again, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about Brexit. Brexit took the elites in the UK and around the world by surprise, and it was an unexpected vote, not atypical for, let's say, this election season around the world. What I think that people can expect depends on what kind of landing the UK gets. Is it soft Brexit or hard Brexit? And nobody knows for sure. The Prime Minister is really talking more along the lines of hard Brexit, restoring the sovereignty of the UK. It is problematic to some extent for companies. So many multinationals, for English language and good institutions and all of that, have based their headquarters in the UK, and as the most comfortable and natural place, and also a big service provider to the European Union. So I think there will be companies that at least hedge their bets by establishing maybe a headquarters, maybe a second key location somewhere else in the European Union, because it's going to be a several-year process. After all, apparently the Prime Minister indicated that Article 50 won't be triggered until, well, March of next year. Then it's a 2-year process of negotiation. And how free the trade is at that point between Great Britain or the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union really depends on the terms that are negotiated over several years, which leads to your second question, I think. So nobody really knows where it's going to come out, but I think the world will want to trade with the UK, and the UK really wants access to the world's largest market. It wants to control migration and things like that, but usually you can't do that and get the most favorable terms. So what does that mean for US companies who just want to position themselves in a place that makes sense? I think many can take a wait and see attitude because things will firm up in about a year and a half or 2 years about what the outlines will look like. But there's probably no need to do something immediately, although companies need to plan. Secondly, many of the laws that impact US companies, other than tax and so forth, will not be affected. For instance, the UK, in accordance with EU requirements, has the Data Protection Act. It's unlikely that that stringent act regarding transfer of data from servers in the UK or Europe to the US will change much. So it's best that companies in the US continue to assume that most of the legislation, because it is already on the books or in the statutes of the United Kingdom, will remain.
Right. Now your firm not only works with large companies, but also helps early stage growth companies on various transactions. What are some of the biggest legal mistakes you see made by startups today?
I'm glad you asked that question. Exactly 2 years ago, I wrote a blog, which then got published statewide in California by the Daily Journal, and it is on my website at nefflaw.com, and it's called Startups Need to Start Protecting Intellectual Property from the Start. But I'm going to focus on both intellectual property and your question, which is really what mistakes they make. And inevitably, startups are going to make a lot of mistakes because, first of all, although many entrepreneurs have done other startups and that puts them in a better position, funds are limited and time is limited. And one of the things that's non-obvious is that intellectual property is probably going to be real important to the startup. If it's technology, it needs to be protected by patent or copyright. If it's merely e-commerce, needs to be perhaps an online advertising company or social network. It really needs to be very careful about what it does with personal data. So lots of mistakes are made. Some of the earliest mistakes, and I'll just run through some of them quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but one is companies need a name that's catchy to them. They focus a lot on that, a lot of focus on the name. Then they find a domain name that reflects that name, and if they can get it, they're pretty excited about that. The problem is trademark trumps domain name, and so that if they pick a domain name but somebody else has a very similar trademark, very quickly you may get, as soon as you get noticed by anybody, or maybe on the App Store or something, you may get a cease and desist letter, and suddenly you can't really use that domain name, let alone register the trademark, which would protect it. So you really have to make sure that you can get in a crowded trademark field that trademark related to the domain name and the domain name, which is easier to get than the trademark. That's one thing. On the copyrights, other mistakes companies made is you need a simple non-disclosure agreement. You're sharing your idea, maybe your technology with someone else. You better make sure that they can't share it negligently or run off with the idea. So that's another thing you have to do right at the start. You need to, obviously, companies usually focus on the financial side a little bit more, and maybe they have those relationships in place. But if you're using outside developers to develop technology, to develop your app or something like that, that's a minefield, both because it's hard to find good developers that won't eat up all your cash, but also because you have to make sure they transfer rights to you, they transfer copyright, or you can suddenly find that, let's say you have them create some characters for an animated app or something like that, you may not own them. So those are just some of the startup errors that they make. So you really have to focus on this at the start, because almost no matter what you do, some of this intellectual property, even if it's a domain name, even if it's a brand name that you build value in, or some of your technology that makes it all work, that may be your crown jewels.
So can you dig a little bit deeper into that? We talked about IP. You mentioned IP protection and how important that is today. So what are some measures startups can take? I mean, you mentioned copyright, trademark. How do they know where they start in protecting their intellectual property?
Rihanna, that's a good question. And of course, I'm reluctant to say that's why you need our services or something like that. But once you find a name that you really like as a domain name, and it's not very expensive to buy a few domain names, so go ahead and do that, then you need to do some trademark searching or contact a trademark lawyer and make sure you can lock in that name. Very often it's really the third name they choose or something like that, which is the first name that there's a good chance we can protect, put a trademark barrier around it, likelihood of filing a success, getting an application approved by the trademark office. That's one thing. On copyright, if you're allowing people to post content to your app or site or something like that, you kind of have to do a relatively simple filing with the Copyright Office to protect yourself from copyright liability, because that way you'll be treated as an internet service provider or online service provider. Not that hard to do, but you may not know to do it. You need somebody to take a look, review your development agreement to make sure that the copyright actually transfers to you once you pay for the work done, so that you actually own your app and you're not fighting with some developer about who has the ownership rights.
I think that's good advice. So, Rich, you joined the board of the Tech Council of Southern California back in 2009, and you've remained an active board member there. And I know they recently did a relaunch, which we are a part of and we're excited to be a part of. How has the region, the Southern California region, changed over the past 7 years since you joined the council? And are there certain industries that are gaining more traction in the region?
Rihanna, it's really become such a vibrant tech region. It is tech and media region. Well, it's always been a media region. I mean, with New York, the only counterweight in this respect, we've always had all the major studios. The studios at one time were called studios. Now you can think of them as content companies. They have such tight relationships with a lot of the tech companies. And so the Southern California region has always produced lots of content for the nation and the world. Now, with all the startups, we're about the number, according to one study by City Lab, we're region number 5 in terms of venture capital dollars. But you have to understand that understates our role because a lot of the studios are self-funded and the content producers are self-funded. So by one stat, in just the first half of 2013, the Los Angeles region, Silicon Beach, which I'll talk about in a second, had $1 billion in venture capital funding. Orange County in 2015, which is a big area of software and technology companies, had $1 billion in financing that year. So even though we're listed at about 6% of nationwide venture capital, with all the studio self-funding and with what I think is undercounting because the numbers didn't add up to City Lab's estimates, I think we're up there in the top 4 or 5 regions with San Francisco, Silicon Valley, New York, Seattle, Washington is right behind us. So a very vibrant region. Silicon Beach has grown in the sense that almost every big company from Northern California now has a campus, often producing content in Southern California. If you want to just a list of the names so I don't miss any, I've just pulled this out. I mean, we have campuses or major offices for Google, Yahoo, YouTube, BuzzFeed, Facebook, AOL. Well, Electronic Arts has been here a long time. Viacom, MTV, Snapchat is based here, as are quite a few other companies. So when you get to certain parts of the city, Silicon Beach, which is up Playa Vista and Marina del Rey and Venice and Santa Monica, and then you go to El Segundo in the South Bay, there are pockets in Culver City and Pasadena. It really is radically changed, I would say, in the last 8 or 9 years, and in a very exciting way.
Well, we're excited about all the opportunities that are in Southern California. Rich, thank you so much for your advice and insights today. For more information on the Neff Law Firm, the Tech Council of Southern California, and SIIA, please visit our websites and stay tuned for next week's SIIA Tech Chat.